So we're talking with Hope Morgan Ward, Bishop of the United Methodist Church in North Carolina, and you're kind of an inspiration to me in the idea of traveling over to Europe and seeing historic sites connected with John Wesley. And you took a trip in March 2014. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that trip and really what your inspiration was to take it.
Our thought was that a pilgrimage to the Wesley sites in the United Kingdom would be a wonderful way to learn and relearn and re-engage our Wesleyan heritage. And the 8 district superintendents and I united in a covenant over the last conference year to study again the life, teachings of John Wesley. And we had professors at the Divinity School to come and meet with us. We read things which they suggested. And it was a delightful time of reconnecting and loving again this heritage that we share as United Methodist. And the capstone of the year of re-engaging our Wesleyan heritage was this pilgrimage. We had about 45 people in the group and began in York and then traveled down south to Epworth, over to Bristol and on to London.
So I wanted to kind of start with where Wesley was born and kind of work our way around the different places that you visited. But to start with Epworth, what did you find there? I think the Old Rectory is one of the places that they talk about being available to see.
The Old Rectory is a fascinating house. It predates the Wesleys. They moved into it, and the Wesley family lived in it for 39 years, almost 4 decades. As Samuel Wesley was the pastor of the St. Andrew's Parish in Epworth. And it was in the rectory that Susanna led the household because her husband was away often. Back in those days, when you went to a preacher's meeting in London, you were gone for months at a time, literally 1, 2, 3 months. Susanna, however, spent her life, 40 years of her life at Epworth with the children, and they were born and they grew up in Epworth. And so the town of Epworth is now, of course, larger than it was during the time of the Wesleys. At the time of the Wesleys, it was quite a backwater, way away from the larger centers of population. And it was there that they lived their life, that Susanna taught her children. She met with each of them for 1 hour each week, one-on-one. She insisted that they learn the biblical languages so that they could read the Old and New Testaments in Hebrew and in Greek. She taught the daughters as well as the sons. And the 7 sisters, we know more about the men in the family, Charles, Samuel, John. We know more about them than we know about the girls. The 7 daughters their history is told in a book called The 7 Sisters. And each one of them, of course, has a life story that's told in the book. Some of their lives were not as happy or fulfilling as one might hope, some amazingly tragic. They were, in a sense, overeducated for Epworth, and there were not men around who were as erudite and intellectual as the Wesley sisters. And so that's just a story that I like for us to remember, as well as the very famous 3 Wesley sons.
So Wesley makes his way to school, and I think he starts out in London, and in graduating there goes on to Oxford.
Yes.
And you visited Wesley sites in Oxford, I understand.
We did. We went to Oxford and visited both Christ Church, where John Wesley was ordained, and we visited the college where he was in school. It was at Oxford that Wesley, we like to use the phrase John Wesley was a campus minister. As a student, he and others joined together in a holy club. They visited incarcerated people in prison. They were engaged in ministries of social holiness in Oxford, and they began there to sort of agitate the established church because of the ways in which they were reaching out to all people.
From Oxford, he spent some time in Georgia, actually, and then comes back, and things have kind of changed for him after he leaves Georgia, and he returns to London. Can you tell me a little bit about what you saw at, I believe, Wesley Chapel, and there's some other sites near Wesley Chapel?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. And I'd like to comment just a minute on his time in Georgia because it informs his work as he returns. Many of us have heard the story of his heart warmed after he came home from Georgia, saying, "I converted no one and found myself wondering about my own conversion." Those are my words, not his exact words. And yet, when he was in Georgia, he witnessed slavery, and it continued to be an issue, a social issue and concern in which he engaged across his life. Indeed, his last letter was a letter encouraging the abolition of slavery. And historians pull that thread back to possibly his time in Georgia, where he saw slavery. He did come back to London, and there he and his brother Charles had heartwarming experiences 3 days apart in May on Aldersgate Street. An amazing convergence of their lives and of their awakening to Christ. The place, the exact spot, now has the Museum of London built on it. But there is, outside the Museum of London on a patio overlooking a very busy urban area in London, a huge cross in flame with the words from John Wesley's journal, how he went in and heard reading from Luther's treatise to the Romans. He heard about salvation by faith, not works, and he felt his heart strangely warmed and trusted in Christ. Just around the corner from that spot are places where Charles also had a heartwarming experience. Again, just 3 days separated the two experiences. And the church where John Wesley's father had pastored before going to Epworth.
So one of the things that Wesley did was to start programming in a place called the Foundry. And my understanding is the Foundry doesn't really exist as a place to visit anymore, but Wesley Chapel is like right in that vicinity.
Yes, Wesley Chapel is a beautiful church, a Methodist church, of course, with worship services on Sunday, a very, very engaged and expansive congregation, people singing speaking in many languages, singing together beautifully on the Sunday in which we worshiped. There is an expansive museum underneath the church with paintings and memorabilia from the Wesley's life and journeys. And the house next to the chapel is the house where John Wesley lived in London for many years. There's a small room that was his prayer closet where he spent time each day early in the morning at 4 a.m. There are numbers of things on the first level of the house. His preaching robe, and when you see his preaching robe, you realize that indeed, when he stood to his full stature, he was all of 5'3". He was a very small man. We are not the first to have virtual offices here in the North Carolina Conference. Our superintendents no longer have an office with an address, but their office is with them wherever they go. And John Wesley had a little traveling desk. It's about this big. He would carry it on horseback, and then he could set it up with his pen, and he could write in the evenings wherever he was. So these sorts of things from the life of Wesley are really very inspiring. He has an exercise chair, which is really a chair that sort of bounces up and down, simulating horseback riding. He was a great advocate of exercise, and when it was rainy, which, it rains every now and then in London, when it was a rainy day out, he would exercise indoors. He also had a chair that is configured so that he would sit on the chair toward the back of the chair, and the back of the chair had a little place to put a book. And he believed that was very healthy, and it helped him with his back to not have back pain by sitting very erect and sitting in the chair a particular way. The famous electrifier is in the house. John Wesley believed, as did many in his time, that electrification is helpful to the body for all sorts of ailments. Even today, we know that if our heart stops, we hope somebody close by has that medical device that would jar our heart back. Well, the electrifier that John Wesley used is in his house.
Wow. One of the other places that I hadn't realized until your trip that was really attached to the Wesleys is Bristol, and that is where Charles Wesley's home was. It's also one of the first sites where the Methodists actually purchased property and established a meeting place. Yes,
the very first Methodist property is in Bristol, and it's an amazing place to visit. The pulpit can only be reached from the balcony. It was designed that way so that if people got upset at the preacher, because the Methodist preachers created disturbances in Bristol by resisting the slave trade, for example, and Bristol being a port was a place where the slave trade was very integrated into the life of the city, and so pushing back against the slave trade in Bristol was a dangerous thing to do. But when you go in the new chapel, this first Methodist building, there are no windows on the ground floor. The windows are higher, again, to protect the people who are worshiping and to protect the preacher. The building is designed so that people will be safe there, and hecklers and egg throwers and rotten tomato throwers would not be able to assault the preacher very easily. And Wesley had upstairs above the balcony a third level where there are rooms where the circuit riding preachers could stay when they were in Bristol. There are a couple rooms where Wesley himself stayed when he was in Bristol. And there's a window. When you're in the pulpit and you look up, there's a window from this third floor. And our guides there told us that Mr. Wesley would sometimes come to that window and look down upon the preacher, which would be pretty overwhelming to any of us to think of preaching with Father Wesley watching from the window and judging our sermon. The world is my parish is a famous Methodist saying. It's on many church bulletins and pamphlets. We see it often whenever we look at Methodist memorabilia, but very few of us know the story of the saying. It actually came from Bristol when John Wesley was engaging with the poor, teaching little children, resisting the slave trade. And the established church became rather distressed. And the Anglican bishop called Mr. Wesley in and said, "You're causing too much trouble. You got to get out of town. Leave Bristol. You've got to get out of town. Leave our city." And John Wesley drew himself up to his full 5'3", I'm sure, and said to the bishop, "I consider the world as my parish, and I believe God has appointed me to this work, and I will not forsake it." So what he was saying in saying the world is my parish is that this is my parish. Wherever in the world I am, this is my parish. This is the place God has appointed me. And while we often throw our arms wide and say the world is our parish, so let's work in places far away, the context of this saying was Wesley's dogged determination to work in Bristol, and he would not be moved. Like a tree planted by the water, he would not be moved.
So you made this trip, you went to these sites. What did you come away with about your views of Wesley? Did they change? Was it something that drew you into him more, or what did you learn?
Yes. I came home very, very joyful to be a United Methodist. I've been a United Methodist my whole life. But there was something about particular places, hearing these stories again, standing on these places of holy ground that were spirit forming for me. I actually went over a few days early with my mom, and we rented a car, went up to Durham in the northeastern corner of England. I had read that it was there that Methodism just flourished. It spread so fast. And that there were small Methodist chapels, and that the oldest of these was in a place called Weardale, even a little outside Weardale. Irishoppen is the name of the oldest of these chapels, and that John Wesley himself preached there 17 times. So we took off from Durham and rode up into the mountains and across the dales and made our way to Weardale. We found Irishoppen Church. It was locked, and went up and knocked on the door. Nobody answered, so I went around to a window and looked in the way we do sometimes. It was obvious you could see inside. Frightened the member of the church who was cleaning, startled her. But she motioned to us to come back to the door, and she opened the door, and Mom and I went into the church, and were able to be in that church where John Wesley himself had preached 17 times. And there was on the wall this beautiful drawing of John Wesley coming toward the Irishoppen Church. And underneath the etching was John Wesley riding in on the horse with lots of people, young, old, children, like a Palm Sunday parade almost, surrounding the horse as he rides up to the church. And underneath is a quotation from his journal, a Tuesday evening in May, in which he says, "We rode on to Weardale. I had been out of order all night and found myself greatly weakened. However, I trusted in the strong, capital S, I trusted in the strong for strength and began to preach to the gathered congregation. I did not stop until I finished my discourse. I did not want for strength, nor did the people want for a blessing." That quote was one of the great gifts of the trip for me in realizing the way in which our forebears pressed on even beyond their strength to receive God's strength to do this amazing, absolutely amazing work.
One last question. What should we, who are quite removed from John Wesley in some respects, what should we think about him? What role should he play in our lives today?
The quotes that I mentioned to you, I think carry me forward as a Methodist. I love the world is my parish in the context that I described to you a few moments ago. The world is my parish. God has given me in this time this work to do, and I'm going to do it. That kind of dogged determination to be God's person wherever we find ourselves in the world. To engage the social ills of our time, to be courageous, to be strong. I love the quote on the church in Irishoppen. I was out of order. I didn't feel good. I felt weak, but I trusted in the strong, capital S, the strong. Since seeing that quote, I actually think of God as the strong. I trusted in the strong for strength, and I did what I was called to do, and I found that I didn't give out, that though I was weak, God gave me strength, and the people were blessed. Those two quotes, for me, sort of summarize the inspiration of this experience, of the way that we as Methodist people live in the world, the way that we receive grace and share grace.
We've been talking about John Wesley with Hope Morgan Ward, Bishop of the North Carolina Conference, the United Methodist Church. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Grace and peace.